It happened in a room meant for quiet conversations, not confessions. King Charles had been pacing alone in Clarence's house, unusually tense, when the door opened and Catherine stepped inside. What followed wasn't protocol, it wasn't planned, and it wasn't something anyone in the royal family expected. The moment Charles froze, staring at her as if seeing a ghost, something in the air shifted. And when he finally spoke, the truth he revealed left even Camilla, usually unshakable, completely speechless. What could he possibly have said? Before we unravel this emotional moment, feel free to tap like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy stories that go beyond the headlines, go ahead and share this video with someone who follows the royal family closely. All right, let's get into IT. IT began on one of those unusually quiet mornings inside Clarence's house, the kind that feels too calm, almost like the building is holding its breath. The staff moved softly, as if they sensed something was off. The royal guard standing near the private corridor exchanged looks, whispering that the king had been pacing since dawn. They didn't know why. No official meeting, no crises, no grand announcement, just a tension in the air sharp enough to cut through. King Charles wasn't a man who paced. He usually carried himself with the practiced stillness of someone who'd waited decades to take the throne, controlled, measured, always aware of the eyes watching him. But that morning, he seemed to be walking circles not around a room, but around his own thoughts. One royal guard later said he looked haunted, as if something from the past had followed him into the present. Then footsteps, soft, swift, familiar. Catherine's. The guard nearest the door straightened instantly. It wasn't a scheduled visit. She wasn't expected. And yet, there she was, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepping down the long carpeted corridor in a pale blue coat dress that moved gently as she walked. Her expression was calm, but there was something searching in her eyes, something that suggested she had come with purpose, a purpose even she hadn't fully named. When she reached the door of the private sitting room, the guard opened it for her without hesitation. She offered a grateful nod, then stepped inside, and that was when everything changed. The moment Charles looked up and saw her, he froze. Not paused, not hesitated. Froze, as if the whole room had gone still except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Catherine stopped, startled by the expression on his face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was something deeper, older, like he was staring at someone he thought he'd already lost. For a brief second, something passed between them, something silent, weighty, and impossible to describe without cheapening it. Catherine took a step toward him. "Your Majesty, are you all right?" But Charles didn't respond right away. His eyes didn't leave her face. And Catherine, usually so composed, felt suddenly unsure, like she had unintentionally walked into a moment not meant to be witnessed. Finally, he exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "Catherine," he whispered, "not princess. Not Catherine, dear. Just her name. Bare, unprotected, human." She frowned gently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He gave a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it. "It feels like I have." Catherine blinked, unsure what to make of that. Charles stepped closer, studying her as if searching for something. An expression, a gesture, a memory. She didn't know where to look. Moments like this didn't belong in royal life. They belonged in old novels, locked letters, private diaries no one ever read. Charles opened his mouth as if to speak, but something in the hallway shifted. Faint footsteps, flourishes of movement. The door hadn't fully closed. And on the other side, Camilla had been walking toward the room. What happened next would later be whispered by the royal guards for months. Camilla reached the doorway, intended to ask Charles a question, but she stopped mid-sentence when she saw the look on his face. The way his shoulders had dropped, the way his eyes had softened, the way his breath seemed to tremble in his chest. She had never seen him look that way at anyone except one person, Diana. The resemblance wasn't literal. Catherine and Diana looked nothing alike in the surface details. But there was something in Catherine's kindness, something in her gentle strength, something in the quiet way she carried the pressure of the monarchy, something Charles recognized from decades ago. And in that moment, as Camilla stood half hidden by the doorframe, she saw it, too. She didn't say anything. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there, caught between confusion and something colder, harder to define. Catherine, unaware that Camilla was watching, placed a hand softly on Charles's arm. "What's wrong?" she asked again, quieter now. Charles swallowed. His voice cracked, and the confession he'd been holding, one he never intended to say aloud, not to Camilla, not to William, not to the world, finally pushed itself free. "I saw someone in you today," he murmured. "Someone I thought I had lost forever. And it frightened me because I still don't know how to live with the guilt of not protecting her." Catherine's breath stilled. He didn't need to say the name. Diana's presence filled the silence like a shadow made of memory. For the first time in years, Charles looked unbearably fragile. Catherine stepped closer, her voice steady but soft. "You did what you could. You've carried this weight for too long." Charles shook his head. His eyes glistened, not with dramatic flourish, but with the exhaustion of a man who'd been running from something inside himself for decades. "I failed her," he whispered. "And seeing you today, it felt like she was standing right in front of me. It hit me so suddenly I didn't know how to breathe." Behind a half-open door, Camilla clenched her jaw so tightly that one of the guards noticed her hand trembling. This was not what she expected to hear. Not today. Not ever. Catherine, still unaware, placed her other hand over Charles's. It wasn't a royal gesture. It was a human one, a small act of compassion, without an ounce of performance behind it. "Charles," she began, choosing her words carefully, "you didn't fail her. Life failed her. Circumstances failed her. The world failed her. But you—" She paused, her voice thickening just slightly. "You've spent years trying to make peace with something no one could truly heal from." He looked at her, not as his daughter-in-law, not as the future queen, but as someone who had just held out a lifeline he didn't know he needed. And in the hallway, Camilla felt something heavy twist in her chest. This wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was the realization that Charles had a grief she could never touch, never comfort, never fully understand. The guard on duty later said Camilla's face went from composed to pale, then to something almost unreadable, as if she had just heard a confession that shifted the ground beneath her. She took a silent step back, pressing herself against the wall, completely stunned. Inside the room, Charles whispered, "Thank you, Catherine. More than you know." And Catherine, with quiet sincerity, replied, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." The clock ticked. The room breathed. The moment stretched, fragile, unguarded, unforgettable. And then silence, the kind that says everything. What Charles saw in that first instant wasn't Catherine, as the world sees her, the polished future queen, the steady hand beside William, the woman who carries royal pressure like a second skin. No, what he saw was something far more personal, something he didn't expect, something he thought he'd buried deep enough that it would never surface again. But memories don't stay buried. They wait. And that morning, when Catherine stepped into the room with that gentle look of concern, the past collided with the present so forcefully that Charles felt his chest tighten. At first, he couldn't understand it. Why did his breath catch? Why did his mind flash backwards? And why did he feel the old grief rise like a tide that had been held back too long? He saw Diana, not in Catherine's face. Catherine has her own presence, her own grace, her own way of lighting up a room. It wasn't physical. It was something about the softness in her eyes, the tilt of her head, the compassion that seemed instinctive rather than performed. Something eerily similar to the way Diana used to look at him long before their marriage cracked under the weight of expectations neither of them were ready for. Decades had passed, and yet grief is a habit of finding the perfect moment to remind you it still lives inside you. Charles never spoke about it openly. Not to courtiers, not to journalists, not to Camilla. The world assumed his life had moved cleanly forward, that grief had settled into a polite, quiet corner of his heart. But grief is not polite. It is not quiet. It can sleep for years and wake up roaring with the slightest trigger. And Catherine had been that trigger. The Royal Guards had noticed something changing in Charles over the past few months. Subtle, but there. He'd been reflective, nostalgic, sometimes staring too long at portraits in the palace halls. He'd become more concerned about William and Catherine's well-being, checking on him more often, asking questions he never used to ask. No one connected the dots. No one imagined that the king might still be wrestling with the ghosts of a past the public had moved on from. But the heart has its own timeline. When Catherine stepped into that quiet room, Charles felt something inside him shake loose. He saw her calm expression, her steady presence, the kind of gentleness that doesn't shout for attention but quietly fills the space around it. It brought back an old memory, one he had tried to forget. Years ago, before the world tore their marriage apart, Diana had walked into his office after a long day. He had been frustrated, overwhelmed, drowning in paperwork and public pressure, and she had simply asked, "Are you all right?" Not with judgment, not with expectation, just simple, pure concern, the kind that says, "I see you," not the role, not the title. You. Charles didn't realize until that morning that he had been longing, desperately, silently, for that kind of compassion again. Catherine gave it without even knowing, and that shook him, because it reminded him of everything he lost, everything he failed to protect, everything he wished had been different. He didn't mean to let the emotion rise. He didn't mean for Catherine to see it, and he certainly didn't mean for Camilla to overhear it. But grief doesn't ask permission. It arrives when it needs to. As Catherine stood there, waiting for him to answer, Charles felt himself caught between two timelines, the one he lived and the one he wished he had. He saw William as a boy again, wide-eyed, devastated, clutching Harry's hand at Diana's funeral. He heard the echoes of cameras snapping, the sound of public mourning swelling like a storm outside the palace gates. He had carried that day like a shadow following him from room to room. And seeing Catherine, calm, kind, steady, made that shadow suddenly stretch longer. He wasn't imagining that Catherine had replaced Diana. He knew better than that. Catherine was her own force, her own pillar of strength. Yet something about her presence awakened a truth he never voiced. He missed that gentleness. He missed that purity of care. And he missed a part of himself that had existed before guilt became his constant companion. As his thoughts spiraled, Catherine moved closer, worried. Her soft voice broke through the memories, anchoring him back to the present. "Charles, what are you remembering?" He hesitated. His instinct was to retreat into royal discipline, to push everything down and deflect with formality. But something about her tone, something almost maternal in its warmth, let his guard fall. "It's the way you walked in," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way you looked at me. For a moment, I thought I was looking at the past." Catherine didn't flinch. She didn't make it awkward. She simply listened, and that, more than anything, allowed Charles continue. "There's a kindness in you," he said slowly, "one that feels familiar. It startled me because I wasn't prepared to feel that again." Catherine braced herself, sensing where his mind had gone, but not wanting to assume. And Charles confirmed it. "It reminded me of her," he said, finally giving the memory a name. "It reminded me of Diana." The room fell still. For years, the topic had lived between the generations like a quiet ghost, acknowledged, respected, but rarely confronted head-on. Catherine had always honored Diana's memory with grace. She never overstepped. She never tried to imitate her, and Charles respected that. But the emotional weight of his admission hung in the air, thick and unspoken. And then came the part that shook Catherine to her core. "I failed her," Charles said softly. "And seeing that kindness again, it frightened me, because I realized I've never forgiven myself." Catherine felt her eyes sting, not because of the confession itself, but because of the raw vulnerability behind it. She placed her hand gently on his arm, grounding him, the way one does with someone carrying far too much alone. "You loved her in your own way," she said quietly, "and she loved William. That love shaped him. It shapes all of us." Charles closed his eyes, letting the truth sink in, even if it hurt. "She deserved more," he murmured. "And she would have wanted you to heal," Catherine replied. Those words, simple, sincere, and without judgment, hit Charles harder than the grief itself. Because for the first time, someone wasn't telling him to move on. They were telling him it was okay to try. Outside the doorway, Camilla clutched her hands together. She wasn't angry. She was stunned. because she had never seen Charles open up like this. Not with her, not with anyone. And it made her realize the depth of grief he had carried all these years without ever letting her see. Catherine didn't notice Camilla's presence. She only noticed the way Charles's breathing steadied, the way some of the tension left his shoulders, the way he seemed lighter, just slightly, as if a door inside him had cracked open for the first time in decades. And that was the moment Charles understood why Catherine's presence had shaken him so deeply. She wasn't a reminder of Diana. She was a reminder of a healing he had denied himself. And that realization was powerful enough to change everything. For all the tension in that room, the silence outside the door carried its own weight. Camilla stood half-shadowed in the corridor, her back pressed against the wall, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. She had come looking for Charles with a simple question about an upcoming engagement. Nothing more, nothing dramatic. But when she reached the doorway, she had walked into a moment she was never meant to witness. A moment that froze her in place. The softness in Charles's voice. The tremble. The name he whispered, Diana. Camilla had been navigating the complexities of Charles's past all her life. She had accepted it, endured it, even embraced it at moments. The public compared. The press dissected. The world judged without mercy. But she had always believed that she and Charles shared an understanding, a mutual resilience. Two survivors of a storm they never quite escaped. But in that instant, watching Charles crumble emotionally in front of Catherine, that belief wavered. She stepped back silently, but not far enough to stop hearing their voices. And what surprised her most wasn't Charles's vulnerability. It was Catherine's presence, the gentle steadiness in her tone, the way she comforted him without pretension or fear, the way she understood what he hadn't said aloud. Camilla's chest tightened. A royal guard standing nearby noticed a shift in her posture. Guard were trained to observe, not react. But even he sensed that something delicate was unfolding, something he would later describe to a colleague as the most human moment I've ever seen in a palace. Camilla wasn't proud of eavesdropping, not even for a second. But grief is a complicated landscape. And hearing your husband confess an emotional wound you never knew he still carried, that's enough to make even the strongest person pause. The guard lowered his gaze respectfully, pretending to adjust his stance, giving her a moment of privacy, without moving away. Even he could feel the fragile tension humming through the corridor. Inside the room, Charles's voice continued, low and unsteady. "It's strange," he said to Catherine. "I've lived so long trying to make peace with my past. But today, it feels as if I'm right back where I started." Catherine nodded, her expression warm and patient. "Healing isn't a straight line," she murmured. "It's messy. It comes back in pieces." Camilla clenched her hands. There it was, the quiet wisdom Catherine carried with ease, the calm that made people trust her, the grace that drew the nation to her without effort. It wasn't jealousy Camilla felt. It was a sting of unexpected truth. For years, she had stood by Charles through the harshest public judgment. She had supported him through political storms, health scares, family crises. She had held him up in ways the world never saw. But she never knew the full extent of the grief he still carried. She had assumed time had softened the edges. But time does not heal all wounds. Some wounds simply grow quieter. She exhaled, a shaky breath, one the guard heard but pretended not to. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind was recording every detail, every tremor in her voice, every shift in her posture. Guards witnessed everything, but they shared nothing. Their silence was part of the palace walls. After several long moments, Camilla finally stepped away from the doorway, just far enough that she could no longer hear their words clearly, but still close enough that the emotions continued to crash over her like waves. Inside, Charles continued speaking, unaware of the impact his words were having beyond the room. "You remind me of the way she saw people," he said to Catherine. "Not the role, not the crown, just the person underneath." Catherine didn't rush to respond. She absorbed his words, letting the silence settle comfortably before offering her own. "She would be proud of you," Catherine said finally. "More than you know." Charles looked away, blinking rapidly. Outside, Camilla closed her eyes. The guard shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of her vulnerability. Royals rarely revealed their emotions in public, even in the confines of palace corridors. But this was different. This was a moment of unspoken pain, one he knew would never be mentioned again after today. Camilla opened her eyes slowly, gathering herself. She had always prided herself on strength, on resilience shaped from years of surviving public scrutiny. But this moment wasn't about the public. It wasn't about headlines or approval ratings. It was personal, deeply, unexpectedly personal. Camilla stepped forward again, this time to gather her composure rather than to listen. She adjusted the fold of her coat, smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders. The transformation was subtle. Only someone trained to watch the slightest details would notice. And the guard noticed. She had just rebuilt herself in 3 seconds. Inside, Catherine's voice softened even more. "You're not alone in this," she told Charles. "William carries it. Harry carries it. And I carry it because I love them. We all do." Charles looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You've carried more than we've ever asked you to," he said quietly. "More than the world realizes." Catherine smiled faintly. "That's what family does." And that was the moment something shifted, not just between Charles and Catherine, but in the corridor where Camilla stood, listening to half-formed truths and emotions wrapped in shadows. The guard felt the shift too, the sense that something profound was happening, something that would ripple through the palace long after this morning ended. Camilla inhaled deeply. Then, with a calmness that cost her far more than she would ever admit, she turned to the guard and said softly, "Not a word of this." The guard bowed his head. "Of course, Your Majesty." She hesitated, then asked a question she had never needed to ask before. "Did I interrupt something?" The guard paused, just long enough that the silence answered for him. Camilla nodded, accepting the truth without wanting to dig into it. "Thank you," she murmured, though she wasn't sure for what. Perhaps for witnessing her vulnerability without judgment, perhaps for pretending he hadn't. She didn't re-enter the room. She didn't challenge Charles. She didn't question Catherine. Instead, she walked slowly down the hallway, her steps silent but heavy. For the first time, the palace didn't feel like her sanctuary. It felt like a place full of ghosts, some hers, some Charles's, some belonging to a past that refused to stay buried. The guard watched her go, feeling something he never expected to feel for a queen: sympathy. He had witnessed hundreds of palace dramas, whispers behind closed doors, quiet heartbreaks no one ever knew about. But this one felt different. This one felt painfully human. Inside the room, Charles and Catherine continued talking, unaware that their conversation had cracked open a truth in someone watching from the shadows. And in that quiet corridor, with the soft echo of Camilla's footsteps fading into the distance, the royal guard understood something. Some palace secrets are not about power. They're about the fragile hearts that carry the crown. And this morning of confessions and silence was one the palace would never forget. The atmosphere inside Clarence's house had shifted, not in a dramatic, thunderous way, but in that quiet, unmistakable way a room changes after someone speaks the truth they've hidden for years. Charles stood beside the window, still absorbing the aftermath of his confession, while Catherine remained nearby, giving him space without leaving him alone. Outside, the gardens looked peaceful, almost unreal compared to the emotional storm inside. Birds moved across the lawn. A gardener trimmed a hedge. Life continued, unaware that a king had just pulled the curtain back on a part of his heart he had spent decades protecting. Catherine watched him, the light catching faint lines beneath his eyes, lines carved from years of responsibility, loss, and a lifetime spent balancing duty with personal pain. "You don't have to say anything else," she said softly. "I understand." Charles nodded slowly, though a piece of him still trembled. "I didn't expect it," he admitted. "When you walked in, I don't know what happened. It was as if time folded." Catherine didn't interrupt. She let him speak, really speak, in a way only a few people in his life ever allowed. "I don't talk about Diana much," he continued. "Not because I've forgotten, but because remembering hurts." Catherine stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You loved her, in your way." Charles looked down. "Yes, I did, and I failed her in ways that I can never repair. It was a rare statement, raw and unfiltered. A king admitting regret not to history, not to the public, but to the woman who would one day be queen beside his son. Catherine placed her hand softly against the table, grounding herself. She would want you to forgive yourself, she said. For William, for Harry, for your own peace. Charles's breath caught. Forgiveness felt like a foreign language, one he had never learned to speak. Before he could reply, the door quietly opened. It was Camilla. She stepped inside with composed expression, though anyone who knew her well could see something fractured beneath the surface, a hint of shaken confidence behind her eyes, a stiffness in her shoulders. Catherine instinctively stepped back, giving space. Camilla's eyes moved from Catherine to Charles, then back again. There was no accusation, no dramatic tone, just a quiet, fragile searching, as if she were trying to understand something she carried for far too long. "Charles," she said, her voice steady but thinner than usual. "May I speak with you?" Catherine gave a polite nod and turned toward the door, intending to excuse herself. But Camilla surprised her. "No," she said softly. "Stay." It was not an order. It was a request, a vulnerable one. Catherine paused and stayed. Camilla's gaze rested on Charles. "I overheard part of your conversation," she admitted. "Not intentionally, but I did." Charles's face tensed with concern. "Camilla, She lifted a hand gently, stopping him. "It's all right. Truly. I just want to understand." The silence that followed was delicate, like thin glass stretching between three of them. Camilla drew in a breath. "I've lived beside your grief for a long time," she said, "but I didn't know it still lived so deeply inside you." Charles swallowed. "It's my failing. I should have spoken to you." She shook her head. "No, grief is not something you explain. It's something you learn to live with." For a moment, Camilla looked tired, not from the world outside, but from the weight she had carried silently for years. "I loved you through the storm of public judgment," she continued. "I loved you through every headline, every whisper. But I always believed that the past was quieter now." She looked at Catherine gently, not with resentment, but with an unexpected vulnerability. "Seeing you comfort him today made me realize something important." Catherine listened respectfully. Camilla's voice softened even more. "You remind Charles of part of Diana that brought light into a room, and that frightens him. But it doesn't mean he loves you more than he loves me. It means he still loves the memory of someone he couldn't save." Charles flinched slightly, not from guilt, but from the truth of her words. Camilla stepped closer, her tone calm but unwavering. "You have been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you, and it has made you afraid to love fully. Even now." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but she continued gently, "It's time to stop." Catherine watched as decades of unspoken emotion passed between them. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a moment of truth for all three. What Camilla said next changed everything. "Charles," she whispered, a faint tremble in her voice, "grief doesn't mean you failed her, and love doesn't mean you betray me." Charles looked at her, eyes softening with gratitude. Camilla blinked back the smallest hint of tears. "I know what the world says about me. I've heard every insult, every comparison. But I chose you, and I stayed, not because it was easy, but because I knew your heart. All of it." Charles's breath shook. Catherine looked away briefly, realizing she was witnessing a moment sacred to them both. Camilla stepped closer to Charles and gently took his hand. Let her memory be a bridge, not a wound. Charles's throat tightened as he whispered, "I never intended to hurt you." "I know," Camilla replied softly. "But healing begins when you allow yourself to be human. Even now." For the first time that morning, Charles looked lighter, not healed, not transformed, but softened, as if a burden had loosened its grip. Catherine stepped forward, speaking gently. "You both carry a history the rest of us can only imagine, and yet you stand here together. That's what matters." Camilla gave a warm, grateful nod. Charles closed his eyes, releasing the breath he'd been holding for decades. "I'm sorry," he whispered to both women, "for not letting either of you into the part of me that hurts." Catherine smiled kindly. "You're letting us in now." Camilla squeezed his hand. "And that's enough." The room felt different after that. Lighter, warmer, wrapped in a quiet dignity that came only from truth, acceptance, and compassion. Catherine stepped back with a small smile. "I'll leave you both to talk." Camilla reached out and touched Catherine's arm. "Thank you," she said, sincere and steady, "for being someone he could finally speak to." Catherine bowed her head respectfully. "We're family. That's what we do." As she left the room, the Royal Guard station outside watched her go with a quiet sense of awe. The palace had seen arguments, secrets, power struggles, but moments of genuine healing, those were rare. Inside, Charles and Camilla sat together, hands intertwined. No longer king and queen, but two human beings navigating the weight of the past with newfound understanding. That morning didn't solve everything. It didn't erase history. It didn't silence grief. But it opened a door toward healing, toward honesty, toward a future built not on regrets, but on the strength to face them. And for the first time in a very long time, King Charles felt like he could breathe.